The expulsion letter was dated the same day as the diploma. Kesia Asante, no relation to Gabriel, just a name that belonged to more than one person, as names do, sat in Principal Richard Townsend's office at 7:48 a.m. on the morning of Lakeview Academy's commencement ceremony and read both documents side by side. The diploma. Kesia A. Asante having completed the requirements for graduation with highest honors. The expulsion. Effective this date for conduct unbecoming a student of Lakeview Academy, in violation of Section 4.7 of the Student Handbook, the details of which have been communicated to the student and her family. Both on school letterhead, both signed by Richard Townsend, both dated June 8th. She read them twice. She set them down on the desk between her and Principal Townsend. She looked at him with the expression of a 17-year-old who had spent 4 years at this school building a record that existed to protect her against exactly this kind of mourning, and who was now discovering that the record had not been sufficient, and who was processing this information with the specific composure of someone who had been prepared by the adults in her life for the possibility that it wouldn't be. Seaside, I'd like to call my mother. Principal Townsend said she could call after their conversation. She said, I'd like to call my mother now. She called her mother. Her mother said 4 words, don't sign anything yet. Then she said she was on her way. What Richard Townsend had in his office that morning and what he was about to learn was insufficient, was a photograph. Lakeview Academy was a private preparatory school in a suburb whose property values communicated everything about the suburb that needed to be communicated. It had an endowment and a dress code and a graduation tradition that involved white dresses and the school hymn, and the kind of ceremony that parents photographed in ways suggesting they had been waiting their entire lives for this particular morning. It had 240 students, 31 of whom were Black, and a history of academic excellence that expressed itself unevenly depending on which students were being excellent and who was watching. Kesia had been excellent in every way the school had available for measuring excellence. GPA of 3.96. Captain of the debate team. Editor of the school newspaper. AP classes across 7 subjects. Perfect 5s on 4 of them. Community service hours that exceeded the graduation requirement by a factor of 3. Organized through a tutoring program she had founded in her sophomore year in partnership with the local library. She was one of 3 students in Lakeview's history to be admitted early decision to Yale, which she had been in November. A fact that Principal Townsend had announced at the December assembly, while Kesia sat in the second row and wondered why her admission was being announced rather than her own. She was also one of 14 students who had attended a planning meeting for the graduation speech. The graduation speech was the source of the photograph. The tradition at Lakeview was that the valedictorian, selected by GPA, gave the graduation speech. Kesia's GPA was the highest in the class. She was the valedictorian. She had been informed of this in February. She had spent 3 months writing a speech that she had submitted for review in April. A speech that the administration had asked her to revise, a speech that the administration had asked her to revise again, which she had, and which had been approved in its 3rd version in May. The approved speech was about resilience and the future, and the responsibilities of education to the communities it served. It was a good speech. It was not the speech she intended to give. The photograph that Principal Townsend had in his office showed a planning meeting from 2 weeks earlier. Kesia at a whiteboard, 12 classmates around the table. The whiteboard showing an outline that was not the approved speech. It was a speech about the documented disparities in disciplinary actions at Lakeview between Black students and white students. Sourced from the school's own annual equity report, a report that was published every year and which Kesia had been reading since 9th grade. The speech cited specific numbers. The speech named specific patterns. The speech was, in the assessment of the school's board chair, who had been shown the photograph, a liability. The photograph had been taken by a student who had then sent it to a parent who had sent it to the board chair who had called Richard Townsend on Monday morning. This was Wednesday. Richard Townsend was 53 years old and had been a principal for 11 years and had spent those 11 years understanding himself as a fair man. He had a diversity statement on the wall of his office, framed with a font he had selected. He had attended 3 equity trainings over 5 years, each one producing a certificate he had filed in his professional development folder. He coached his staff when students complained about inequitable treatment, to consider impact as well as intent. He believed these things. E also believed that his school's relationship with its board was the foundation of everything he had built, and that the board's preferences were, at a sufficient level of urgency, his preferences. Because the alternative was a different kind of conversation that he had not prepared himself to have. He had spent Monday and Tuesday finding Section 4.7. Section 4.7 covered conduct unbecoming a student, which was defined broadly enough to mean what he needed it to mean if he chose to apply it that way. The planning meeting photograph showed what he needed it to show if he chose to apply it that way. He had known, in some part of himself he was not examining directly, that the photograph had come to him through a path that was itself a problem. A student surveilling another student's private planning meeting and forwarding the result to a parent who forwarded it to the board, and had chosen not to examine that path directly because examining it would have required conclusions he was not prepared to reach. He had not consulted Kesia. He had not investigated. He had not followed the disciplinary procedure in Section 8.2 that required 3 documented warnings before an expulsion could be issued. He had found the tool and used it because the phone call from the board chair had been clear about what was needed, and he had understood the call clearly. He had not counted on the Kesia Asante he met in his office at 7:48 a.m. He had met Kesia Asante many times in 4 years. In assemblies, in award ceremonies, in the December meeting where he announced her Yale admission, and he had seen each time a high-achieving student, which was the full extent of his attention. He had not seen what her mother had been building for 17 years. In the conversations he had not been present for, he had not seen the folder. Kesia's mother, Dr. Amara Asante, not the Dr. Amara from the surgeon script, just another Amara, as the name belonged to more than one person, arrived at the school at 8:17. She was a civil rights attorney. She had been a civil rights attorney for 19 years. She had spent 19 years doing the specific work of understanding what institutions were permitted to do to people and what they were not, and of being very clear, in precise legal language, about the difference. She had also spent 17 years raising a daughter who was going to give a speech at graduation that she had known about since March. And she had spent those 17 years preparing that daughter for the possibility that the world would not always accommodate what the daughter was capable of. And that preparation had included 2 conversations in 9th grade, and 1 in 10th, and 1 in 11th, and 1 in February, when the valedictorian announcement came that all began with the same instrucción: document everything. Kesia had documented everything. Dr. Asante set a folder on Principal Townsend's desk beside the 2 letters. The folder contained the following items, each with a date stamp: the original speech submission from April, the first revision request from the administration citing specific passages, the first revised submission, the second revision request citing additional passages, the second revised submission, the written approval from the assistant principal, dated May 14th, with the specific language, speech approved for delivery as submitted, a copy of Section 8.2 of the student handbook, the disciplinary procedure with the 3 warning requirement highlighted in yellow, and a copy of the photograph of the planning meeting, with a written analysis, Kesia's, in her own handwriting dated 2 weeks ago, of the school's surveillance of a student's private academic preparation. The folder was the size of the 4 years that had built it. Dr. Asante had not assembled it that morning. She had been adding to it since September of Kesia's 9th grade year, in the same systematic way she assembled case files, because her daughter was Black and attending a majority-white private school, and the math of that situation suggested, from 19 years of professional experience, that there would be a morning like this, one, and that the morning would go better if the folder existed. The folder existed. Dr. Asante looked at Principal Townsend's. She said, "My daughter received no warnings. She received no investigation. She was notified of her expulsion this morning, on the day of her graduation, without any of the procedural protections the school's own handbook requires. I'd like to understand the school's position on why Section 8.2 was not followed." Principal Townsend said that Section 4.7 provided independent authority. Dr. Asante said that Section 4.7 did not suspend the procedural requirements of Section 8.2, as any reading of the 2 sections in context would confirm. and that she was happy to walk through that reading if he would like. And she had the reading prepared, in writing, because she had been awake since 5 a.m. preparing it. But that she was also aware there were 22 minutes from the start of the graduation ceremony, and that there were other people outside who had been waiting to speak with her daughter. Principal Townsend said, "What other people?" The other people were the reason Kezia had submitted the scholarship application in January. The Hargrove Foundation for Educational Equity, a different Hargrove than the Brasserie, different city, just another institution with a name, offered an annual scholarship to a graduating high school senior who demonstrated academic excellence, community contribution, and, specifically, a commitment to education equity in their school community. The scholarship was $50,000. The selection committee reviewed applications in the spring and announced the recipient at the student's graduation ceremony. Kesia had applied in January. She had been notified of her selection in April, the same week as the first revision request on the speech. She had told her mother. She had not told the school. The selection committee chair was a woman named Dr. Patricia Cole, who had driven 45 minutes that morning to present the scholarship at Lakeview's commencement ceremony and who was sitting in the school's visitor parking lot at 8:19 a.m. with two committee members, reading an email her assistant had forwarded from the school's communications office saying that the ceremony was proceeding as scheduled. Dr. Asante had called Dr. Cole at 8 a.m. when she was on the road to the school to inform her of what had happened. Dr. Cole had said, "I see. We'll be there." Dr. Asante said to Principal Townsend, "The Hargrove Foundation for Educational Equity is in your parking lot. They are here to present their annual scholarship to Kezia at this morning's ceremony. He suggests that before you proceed with the expulsion, you consider what it means for this school when the organization presenting your graduating student scholarship learns that she was expelled this morning for writing a speech about equity." The room had the quality of a room in which the architecture has just changed. Principal Townsend looked at the folder. He looked at the two letters on his desk. He looked at Kezia, who had been sitting with the composed patience of someone who had known this folder existed and had known Dr. Cole was in the parking lot and had waited, in the specific way she had been taught to wait, for the moment when the information could be presented to the person who needed to have it. He said, "I need to make a phone call," Dr. Asante said. "You have 19 minutes before the ceremony begins." The phone call I made was to the board chair, who was already en route to the ceremony, who listened to the summary of what was in the folder and what was in the parking lot, and what the next 19 minutes contained, and who said, after a pause of approximately 8 seconds, that she thought the school should reconsider its position. The expulsion was rescinded at 8:38. The rescission was verbal, from Principal Townsend, who said that on further review, the procedural requirements of Section 8.2 had not been met, and that the school was withdrawing the expulsion effective immediately. Dr. Asante requested the rescission in writing. Townsend produced a handwritten note. Dr. Asante photographed it. She had the note typed and signed before the ceremony began, which it did at 9 a.m., at which point Kesia Asante walked across the stage at Lakeview Academy's commencement in the white dress that was the school's tradition, received her diploma, the only document that was going to be dated June 8, and delivered a speech. Not the approved speech, not the whiteboard speech, a third speech written between 8:45 and 8:58. 13 minutos in a bathroom, with her phone and her mother standing outside. That was the truth of both speeches compressed into 4 minutes. What the school had been, what it could be. What the numbers in its own equity report said needed to change. And what it meant that a student who had spent 4 years building a record precisely because she understood the tools that would be used against her could stand at this podium on this morning and say it anyway. She said it. All of it, in 4 minutes, clearly, with the specific authority of someone who had the documentation and the foundation scholarship and 19 years of a civil rights attorney for a mother and 4 years of building a record that was supposed to protect her and the proof in this morning's folder of exactly what the record was for. She cited the equity report numbers. She named the disparity in disciplinary actions. Black students at Lakeview received formal disciplinary action at 3.4 times the rate of white students, per the school's own published data. She cited what she had originally planned to say, compressed into the time available, that numbers in an annual report. were not accountability. That accountability was what happened when the numbers were named aloud by someone in front of the people who produced them. She sighed she loved the school for what it had given her, and held it accountable for what it had not given others. She sighed the future that this morning celebrated was only worth celebrating if it was a future that worked for everyone in the room, and that the work of making it so was not finished and was not someone else's responsibility. 4 minutes, exactly the time she had. When she finished, the section of the auditorium where the 31 black students' families sat rose first, then the debate team, who had been briefed by no one, but who knew, in the specific way of people who had sat next to Kezia Asante for 4 years, exactly what they had just heard and what it had cost her to say it, and what it meant that she had said it anyway. Then others, in a wave that moved through the auditorium without announcement, until most of the room was standing, which was not the tradition at Lakeview commencements, and which would be discussed for some time afterward, in the parking lot, in family group chats. In the board meeting 3 months later, where the formal complaint was filed, Principio Townsend was seated on the stage. He watched the standing ovation from 12 feet away and understood, in the specific way of a man watching consequences that are still unfolding, that the phone call from the board chair on Monday had cost him more than it had saved. Dr. Patricia Cole presented the scholarship from the podium. She sighed 3 sentences about Kessie's application before she said the amount, that it was the most clearly argued application the committee had received in 8 years, that it demonstrated exactly the kind of commitment to equity the foundation existed to support, and that what she had witnessed in the last 90 minutes had confirmed every conclusion the committee had reached in April. The ceremony concluded at 10:43. Kezia took a photograph with her mother in the white dress and the diploma, the one without the other letter, in front of the school building in the morning light. She sent the photograph to Avena. Not Avena, her grandmother. She didn't have a grandmother named Avena. She sent it to her debate coach, who had been called Abena as long as Kezia had known her, and whose actual name was a different name entirely, and who had been coaching Kezia since 9th grade, and who had read every version of every speech, and who had said, when the first revision request came in April, "Good, they're paying attention. That means it matters." Her coach replied with one word, yes. It was enough. Kezia drove to Yale in August. She had spent the summer the way she had spent the year, working. She added 600 community service hours to the tutoring program, expanded it to 2 library branches, trained 4 student facilitators who would continue it after she left. She wrote a reflection on the graduation morning for the school newspaper, her last piece as editor. That was the most read piece in the paper's history, and that was picked up by a regional education publication. She did not name Principal Townsend. She named a pattern which was more accurate and more useful and harder to dispute. She majored in political science and minored in education policy, and spent her sophomore year as a research assistant on a study of disciplinary disparities in private schools, a study whose principal investigator had read the regional education piece and emailed her in October of her freshman year to ask if she'd be interested in contributing. The study cited the Lakeview Equity Report among its source documents. It cited 8 other school equity reports from comparable institutions and found across all 9 the same pattern the Lakeview report showed: Black students disciplined at 2 to 4 times the rate of white students, with disparities that increased, not decreased, at higher academic performance levels, which was its own finding, a finding that Kezia had data for from her own experience that she had not expected to see confirmed in the aggregate. The study was published in the spring of her junior year. She was listed as a co-author, 3rd author, behind the principal investigator, and a doctoral student who had done the bulk of the statistical analysis, but listed, with her name on the work, in the permanent record of what had been found. Her mother framed it. Her debate coach framed it. They were not competitive about whose frame was better, which was an aspect of their relationship that Kezia found characteristic and that she mentioned in the toast she gave at her coach's retirement party 2 years later. Principal Townsend was no longer at Lakeview by the time the study was published. He had resigned the previous year, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. At a board meeting where 3 families had presented a formal complaint about the graduation morning procedures and requested an external review of the school's disciplinary processes. The review had taken 6 months. It had found what reviews found when they looked carefully, a pattern documented across 4 years of records of disciplinary disparities that matched the equity report's aggregate numbers in the fine-grained detail of individual decisions. The board had issued a statement. The board chair had resigned. The school had hired an external consultant to redesign its disciplinary process, a process that was still ongoing when Kessia read about it in a news alert on her laptop in the Yale Library on a Tuesday in October. She read the article. She thought about the folder her mother had been building since September of her ninth grade year. She thought about 2 conversations in ninth grade and 1 in 10th and 1 in 11th, and the February call and the instruction. Document everything. She would, she always would. That was what you did with the tools they tried to use against you. You learned them better than the people who thought they could use them against you. And then you built something with them that lasted longer than the morning it was meant for. She closed the article. She went back to her research. She had work to do. She always had.